One way that we can tell if someone is diabetic or not is by looking at their response to a meal. Now, the way we simulate that in a lab is we give somebody a sugar load, normally some amount of glucose, between 50 and 100 grams of glucose, and then look at what happens to their blood profile after that. We look at periodic time points after the meal for their glucose concentration and the insulin concentration in their blood. So what we're going to do here is go over how a healthy individual responds to a sugar load, and then we're going to see how diabetics respond to those same sugar loads. So a healthy person starts off with low blood sugar, and then over time after the meal, the glucose rises and the insulin rises together. What happens is the insulin rises after the glucose rises. You ingest your sugar, and as it's starting to be absorbed, your body releases insulin, and that insulin indicates to your cells that it's time to uptake glucose. And so what happens is the glucose rises, and just shortly after that, insulin rises. And as the insulin rises, it pulls the glucose into the cell, which pulls the blood glucose down. So keep in mind, all of these concentrations are blood concentrations of glucose and insulin. So while the concentration of the glucose and insulin goes down, the concentration of glucose in the cell increases because this is being pulled into cells that are not in the blood. There are two types of diabetics, type 1 and type 2 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics are insulin dependent in that they don't release their own insulin. And type 2 diabetics are just insulin insensitive in that when insulin is released into their blood, they don't respond to it as a healthy individual would. Type 2 diabetes is also called adult onset diabetes and is normally correlated with lifestyle choices. It's much more common than type 1 diabetes. Let's look at the insulin responses to a sugar load for type 1 and type 2 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics have very low blood insulin concentrations because the beta cells in their pancreas actually aren't producing insulin in the first place. So over time, their insulin levels are low throughout the whole test. Now, their glucose levels may be low, but once they have a meal, they start increasing. But because they don't have any insulin to pull it in, it just continues to increase, and they can reach very high blood glucose levels because they don't produce their own insulin. Recall that type 2 diabetes is not a problem with insulin secretion, but a problem with insulin sensitivity once it's received by the insulin receptor. Insulin comes from the blood and binds to a cell receptor, the insulin receptor. But something from that process onward goes wrong in type 2 diabetics, in that this protein that migrates to the cell membrane and then draws glucose in does not work as effectively as in a healthy individual. So a type 2 diabetic eats a meal and their glucose increases like normal. And in response to that increased blood glucose, they release insulin, and the insulin increases. But because they're insulin insensitive or partially insulin insensitive, this insulin doesn't quite have the same effect as it would in a healthy individual. So this blood glucose goes really quite high and may be sustained quite high before it finally starts dropping. And at the same time, the amount of insulin released is more than it would be in a healthy individual because the insulin is quite insensitive with respect to pulling the glucose back into the cell. Notice that the total amount of glucose and insulin in the blood is much higher in a type 2 diabetic compared to a healthy person. Now, this can have some drastic and negative health consequences due to this increased glucose concentration in the blood. Now that we know how blood glucose and insulin respond to a meal in healthy individuals and in people with diabetes, we can look to how we treat people with diabetes.